a southerner, in Georgia he was born, where the oranges grow thick and fast and fields of waving corn. And Stalin is a farmer, his fingers they are green, and he has planted the biggest crop the world has ever seen. One day he looked upon the map and frowned and shook his head. There's too much brown and not enough green, these were the words he said. We'll have to change the weather, boys, he said, and then he smiled. So let's begin by planting trees along 3,000 miles. So Stalin rolled his sleeves up then and said it's time to start. The Volga River and the Don, they are too far apart. I think we'd better join them, so come and help me, pal, and we'll build a mighty waterway, the Volga-Don Canal. Then Stalin went into the north, and there saw rivers three, all emptying their waters into the polar sea. Now that's not right, Joe Stalin said, these rivers, they are ours. We'll turn them round and make them work and make electric power. There was a range of mountains that were standing in the way, so Stalin put his hand out and smoothed them all away. For Joe, he is determined to make the land all green, and that's the biggest project that the world has ever seen. Oh, Stalin is a mighty man, and he has a mighty plan. He's harnessed nature to the plow to work for the good of man. He's hammered out the future, the fortunate he has been, and he's made the worker state the best the world has ever seen.
عاش الزرع يوم الشمس ما حست بهاني، حسيت بيها عليه فشت مرة وكبر الزرع وهو مداري عليه وسمعناه بيقول هوية أرض ولادي ورجعت ليا
وسمعناه بيقول هوية أرض ولادي ورجعت ليا
حرمونا سنين وسنين وافتكروا الناس نايمين وطلعنا عليهم يوم خلصنا حقهم ملايين حرمونا سنين وسنين وافتكروا الناس نايمين وطلعنا عليهم يوم خلصنا حقهم ملايين حيوا معايا قولوا معايا
عاش فلاح الثورة
عاش الفن حضارة الأمة يبنيها الفنان يروى حياتها في غنوة في كلمة في صورة بروح وإيمان عاش الفن حضارة الأمة يبنيها الفنان يروى حياتها في غنوة في كلمة في صورة بروح وإيمان واسمعنا بيقولها قوية مجد بلادي عهد عليا
واسمعنا بيقولها هوية مجد بلادي عهد عليا
قلبي وروحي ملك الفني والاتنين لبلادي هدية حيوا معايا قولوا معايا
عاش الفن رسالة
Good evening, everybody, and welcome to The World Tonight. It is the 30th of January 2024 at 35 minutes past 10. Here in perfidious Albion, I greet you all who have arrived so far. And if you haven't done so already, be sure to like and share the stream. Always helps with the viewer numbers. We're on YouTube, Odyssey, and Rumble. There will be an experiment soon regarding a stream on Telegram when I find the time to do it. So, before we get started with tonight's business in hand, let us first of all see who is in the chat and greet them accordingly. Banana Bender, who says, good morning, comrades from a sunny Queensland, and good evening to you from a frosty South Manchester. President Jesus, good afternoon to you. And good evening to Lee and Rian. And Red Star Betty, good evening to you up there in the, what I'm assuming are the cold wilds of the northeast of England. Gonzalo Cabrera, good evening to you. C. Bolt, good evening to you. Good evening to Jenny. And to my comrade Beju down there in the wild lands of the south of England, known as London. And good evening to Beck Druskov, who says, greetings to comrades from London. Good evening to Dan Kowalik, frequent viewer and one-time guest on the program. Go and check out the video that I did with him a few months back. Eduardo, hello to you. Good evening to comrade Marius. And if you haven't watched the videos I did with Marius about American history, be sure to check those out. We're going to have another one of those coming up next month. And Brad, good evening to you. Gurumpkin, good evening to you. Martin, who's working late and got the office to himself. Greetings to Comrade CJ out there in Richmond, Virginia. I am enjoying chipping away at my Soviet education books. Good job, comrade there. Joe Hiroshi, evening from Quincy, Massachusetts. Good to have you here. Morgan, good evening to you. And David Green, who says, good afternoon from the land of Lincoln. I'm assuming that means America in the USA in general or Illinois in particular. So, what are we here to discuss tonight? Now, I wanted to discuss differing considerations regarding patriotism, nationalism, socialism, and the difference between proletarian and bourgeois conceptions of especially the nationalism and the patriotism question. Now, I will begin with something of a self-criticism, as it's always important to acknowledge when one has gone either into print or, in my case, into vocalization with something that was incorrect. And this particular topic is something that was visited by myself and my former podcast partner, Layla, must be 2 years ago now. No, maybe longer. I think it was 3 years ago, when we were doing the audio version of this program, when it was just called Red Star Radio. We had questions on the socialism and patriotism question. And upon, 3 years more learning from 2021 till now, I have come to form slightly, I think, more rounded and more properly Marxist-Leninist opinions. So formally, I took probably a more stereotypically Trotskyite position on this question, in which I considered the patriotism and nationalism question almost abstracted from material conditions and the question of, which class was the ruling class in any particular society. I think I still carried with me in those days the prejudices of early ultra-leftism and Trotskyism and opportunism, in that I considered any expression of national pride, patriotism, or anything like that, especially in imperialist nations, to be something dangerous and should be something that's stamped down upon or avoided at all costs. Now, that was a failure, and it was a failure on my part to properly understand the subject in the whole, shall we say. And I've given my reasons why I failed to understand it. I failed to make the appropriate studies of the history of nationalism, patriotism, etc., and the way in which this was handled in the socialist countries, both currently existing and former. So, for instance, what I should have done was make an examination of how this was handled in the revolutionary period in the Soviet Union and in the former East Germany in particular, given that Tsarist Russia, whilst being an imperialist country, was a peripheral imperialist player in comparison to a country like Germany. So I should have made a study of how the question was handled in the DDR. I should also have taken into consideration the writings of Lenin on the question more deeply than I did. And I think that my answers 3 years ago now were, actually it was probably more 2.5 years ago, my answers, due to lack of research and due to a lack of consideration of the opinions given by Lenin, Stalin, Enver Hoxha to a degree, though his take on it is a little imperfect given his later distortions, and also the writings of Mao and the experience of the Korean Revolutionary War, the War of National Liberation, and the Vietnam War. My failure to look at these properly and being still overly influenced by essentially, Trotskyism, which is in reality a bourgeois ideology and ultimately a form of liberalism, in the way that it seeks to create abstractions and completely separate these from the holistic picture that one requires when doing a proper Marxist analysis. This led me to a conclusion that was both shallow and ill-informed in the way that I delivered it. So the way in which I've developed my thinking on this has, of course, changed since doing that. And the consideration, my consideration when looking to revisit this topic was more motivated by a desire to, firstly, it was motivated by a desire to respond to the sort of bourgeois hysteria that's being whipped up like a drumbeat in the press, or at least they're trying to in Britain. You got various these soft-handed, never broke a sweat in their lives politicians like Lord Billy Hague and Lord Cameron coming, and Boris Johnson, who the hardest thing that Boris Johnson has ever had to do is probably to battle a nasty case of gout, or perhaps sweat a little bit whilst awaiting a paternity test. And you get all these buffoons, these generals, these British generals who've never fought a serious war in their lives. Like, they've done like colonial occupations, all babbling on about national pride and the need to reintroduce compulsory military service and all that utter crap that they're coming out with at the moment. And I thought, well, this merits a re-examination of the nationalism and patriotism question. So I realized then that I also couldn't do that without addressing properly my former errors on the matter. And I believe I also made some criticisms of others. I criticized Caleb Maupin, I believed at the time, and accused him of Browderism. I now recognize that was probably a rather cheap insult and not a proper consideration of the man's views on the subject. And it was more, again, it was a reaction tempered, well, created by lingering Trotskyism and basically a failure to properly educate myself on the Marxist method. I think I still have disagreements with Maupin on a number of questions, but my categorization of his views back then, I believe, was inaccurate and unfair. So, with that out of the way, we can continue. So, my motivations for doing this as a particular stream, I've just gone through, but I want to start before we get there. Is with something, a quotation from the Encyclopedia of Fascism. Now, I want to quote this because, of course, it is a particularly bizarre and strange book, mostly written by the fascist philosopher Gentile, but I think Mussolini stuck his name on it, and it was meant to be like the theoretical expression of fascism, but of course it wasn't actually much of a theoretical expression, given that fascism is mostly just sort of raging reactionary idealism. So the way in which Gentile and Mussolini put this in their Encyclopedia of Fascism is that they claim that that communism leaves no scope, no possibility for heroism, for valor, for distinguishing yourself through great deeds, etc., etc., and that this damns communism, or they call it Bolshevism, in order that they can claim that fascism is the proper and, of course, very masculine expression of valor, heroism, and courage. Now, of course, this is a load of garbage, but of course it's reflective of the extremely idealist nature and reactionary nature, of course, of fascism, and also the fact that this is very much an ideology that comes straight out of the bourgeoisie. There's nothing proletarian about it. And it's the Encyclopedia of Fascism is just a propaganda document. But I wanted to talk about it as a sort of opening point for this program, because it was a particularly a sort of a direct expression of the way in which the bourgeois view things, fascism being, of course, the most undiluted form of bourgeois rule. So the question then that we come to here is, well, what of the differences between nationalism as expressed by the bourgeois and as expressed by the proletariat under the conditions of a workers' state, of the proletariat raised to the level of the ruling class. So the bourgeois nationalism, of course, plays a progressive role overall in historical development, because, of course, it establishes a unified nation state against the fractious rule of the feudal period, and with power and authority being diffused between the different feudal lords, the church, the crown, and multiple sources of power and authority existing in any country, and that these are progressively unified or rapidly unified, depending upon the nature of the particular bourgeois revolution. Now, there's several different stages to the English revolutionary process, going all the way through from Henry VII all the way through to, of course, the final victory in 1745 of the bourgeoisie. But what distinguishes both the English one over a long period of time, the French one over a shorter period of time, and to a certain extent the American experience is, of course, the creation of, though less the American than the French and the English, I think in this case, given the federal nature of the early American government, the way in which that power is, of course, centralized, and a new national state, a much more definitively national state, is created. In England, this is done by Cromwell, and his work is then built on, though of course they'll always deny that they built on it, by the in the period of the restored monarchy. So bourgeois nationalism, of course, immediately then, due to the fact that it is the is one of the elements of the ideology of the bourgeoisie, plays its historical and progressive role, then turns. It turns, of course, into various different forms of chauvinism by necessity, various different forms of justification for imperialism, and of course it plays that role in order to motivate men to fight for it in its wars of conquest overseas, but also so that it can maintain its domination over the subordinated classes inside the country. So if you take, for example, British bourgeois nationalism. Now, British bourgeois nationalism, of course, comes about via the merger of the Scottish and the English ruling classes after the full unification of the crowns, which starts with the accession of James I and VI of Scotland in the early 17th century and reaches its conclusion under the reign of the last Stuart monarch, Queen Anne, in the early 18th century. And this forms, of course, the rather pretentiously titled United Kingdom of Great Britain and Ireland. And this form of bourgeois nationalism is really, there's nothing too Irish about it, to be honest, and never was, due to the fact that Ireland is a subordinated nation which is treated like a colony, even more so after the failure and the putting down of the revolt of the United Irishmen at the very end of the 18th century under the leadership of the great Wolfe Tone, and the abolition of the Irish Parliament shortly after that. So British bourgeois nationalism is, I would argue, in actual fact, a creation of the Scottish and English bourgeoisies collaborating together to build this national project, in which Scotland, England and Wales would, of course, see economic development via industrialization. Ireland would, of course, be perpetually a subjugated nation that was to be used as a country that would be repeatedly reduced to being a source of raw resource extraction and agricultural production, which is, of course, what the British bourgeoisie did all the way through the 19th century. But British bourgeois nationalism, therefore, emerges to, in its very earliest phases, to do two things: consolidate the victory that they've won over the Stuart monarchs by 1745, and also come up with a definition of the newly unified and secure nation that is unifying to its ruling classes. And remember, those ruling classes are English and Scottish mainly. And so there are, of course, aristocrats with Irish titles, but I would hesitate to call them Irishmen. Many of them were directly transplanted from England and Scotland. So the British bourgeois nationalism, of course, immediately, as soon as it is formed, it almost immediately ceases to play a progressive role. It immediately starts to justify, of course, the imperial possessions, which Britain already has. England had had many before the unification of the crowns. Scotland had tried to get some and largely failed. But the unified nation relentlessly pursued colonial acquisitions in the Americas, of course, notwithstanding the loss of the American 13 colonies from 1776 onwards. But they, of course, retained a lot of their holdings in the Caribbean, a limited amount in Central and Southern America, but especially, of course, the literal jewel in the crown being the East India Company's occupation and a hyper-exploitation of India, and the growing, of course, conquest of African colonies as well. This, of course, the fact that it happened so quickly after the final unification of the nation shows how quickly capitalism and its attendant superstructure become reactionary after playing a relatively progressive role. And the usage of British bourgeois nationalism was principally in hammering together a unified ruling class and then being able to motivate subordinated layers in Britain to take up arms and fight. Now, this was especially used, of course, in the time of the British bourgeoisie's campaign against Napoleon, and later on it was used to varying degrees, especially in the later 19th century when British militarism started to grow again. Now, one of the earlier expressions of the British state in Britain was, as Marx and Engels observed, that they didn't actually have a large-scale militarized clique running society. There was, of course, a large-scale military presence in places like India that was, of course, formally attached to the East India Company. But in Britain itself, the garrisons were relatively small. There wasn't a massive standing army until they had the various military disasters in the Crimean War in the 1850s. At that point, they actually professionalized the army. And at that point, it also coincides, of course, with the growth of British imperialism, as, of course, the imperialist system emerges out of capitalism. So just as bourgeois nationalism rapidly in Britain and in France runs its course in terms of it being a progressive force very, very quickly, it reaches the point where then it starts to play the role of doing two things. First of all, as I said, being able to act as an ideology that is not just there to bind the ruling class together or to bind them together in addition to their shared class interests, but of course being an ideology that could be imparted into the petty bourgeoisie, but also the working class, which this is the promotion of British bourgeois nationalism is therefore very much linked to imperialism from the 1860s onwards, when imperialism really starts to fully develop in Britain. And you get, of course, the stagnation or the relative stagnation of the productive forces in Britain and the increasing reliance of the British bourgeoisie on the export of capital to the colonized nations rather than the production of commodities in the home market. So it's become a reactionary force. It's also become a force of social control. By the end of the 19th century, there's nothing progressive in it at all. It's something which is used by the ideologists of the bourgeoisie, one of which will be someone like Cecil Rhodes, to knit together political coalitions in support of imperialism. And you also get within that British bourgeois nationalism taking root within the labour aristocracy of the time, and that playing a devastating and wholly destructive role in the run-up to and the start of World War One. Because, of course, as it's so present within the labour aristocracy, again, based on a very real and material link that the labour aristocracy has to the benefits of imperialism, but also the social democracy in Britain has been chauvinist from its very beginning. One of its founders was a guy called H.R. Hyndman, who was an associate of Marx and Engels. I don't think it would be ever accurate to call him either a comrade or a friend. I don't think Engels, judging from the writings I've seen, the letters where he comments on Hyndman, thought a great deal about him. Hyndman was a former British Tory who became somewhat convinced by Marxism. I think he did one of the earliest proper translations of Das Kapital into English was done by Hyndman, but he retained from his Tory years a rabid chauvinism, and he retained that all the way into the period where he supported British entry into World War One. And so, unlike Germany, where the social democratic leaders at least gave lip service to internationalism, even if it wasn't real by 1914, British social democracy has always been rabidly chauvinistic. So here we get to the point about the difference between between bourgeois nationalism and the nationalism and the patriotism of the rising proletariat. So the mistake that has been made, not just by those who are aligned with the British social democracy, but also by those who aligned themselves with the old Communist Party of Great Britain at various different points, was to not distinguish between these different forms. They, that is the Communist Party, because they became revisionist very early on, prior to 53 in fact, they started adopting all of the tendencies of the Labour Party, including, of course, and this also comes from the fact that the Communist Party had a lot of its roots in the Labour bureaucracy, the trade union bureaucracy. It started reflecting not the rabid chauvinism of the Labour Party leadership necessarily, but it started to show through in things like the giving up on a coherent internationalist view and the adoption of what I would call woolly-minded pacifism. And they started to oppose wars of intervention not based on an internationalist duty, not based on solidarity with the oppressed and colonized peoples of the world, but based on this pacifist no war, war is not good for the working class idea. Now, of course, what this doesn't do is what Stalin says in Foundations of Leninism you should be doing, which is that you should be looking to be building alliances between the working class in the imperialist countries and the subjugated and colonized peoples across the world. And that's the alliance that you need to build if you're ultimately going to succeed in overthrowing imperialism. What the old Communist Party was doing here, and the same goes for France, by the way. Remember the criminal actions of the Communist Party leaders in backing the French war to maintain possession of Algeria. What they were doing was, of course, they were compromising with the left social democracy, which in Britain is defined by its very reactionary attitude towards, well, communists, as there being a lot of the reformists back in the day were all anti-Soviet and anti-communist, and a lot of them were even pro-monarchy in this country, or at least they had a very questionable attitude towards it. So what they were doing was not promoting the alliance that they should have been promoting between the domestic working class and the colonized peoples. What they were doing was they were leaning into, via the promotion of what I'm still going to call woolly pacifism and sort of abstract phrases about peace, again reflective of the line taken by Khrushchev and his complete mangling and deliberate misinterpretation of Lenin's work on peaceful coexistence. And this, of course, led them to a position where they were essentially arguing at various different points that either if socialism hadn't been achieved yet, and they didn't claim that, but Britain was still on the road to socialism, and therefore their opposition to the actions, particularly of Labour governments, was weak at best. So the history of the so-called communists leaning into various forms of chauvinism, compromising with bourgeois forms of nationalism, is a pretty undistinguished and ugly one in this country. And it all comes from, of course, their revisionism, their compromise with social democracy, and their being so thoroughly rooted in the labour and trade union bureaucracies, which are soaked in various different forms of chauvinism. But what would it look like, therefore? And we're going to use Britain as the example here because, of course, this is where I sit. But I'm sure there are comrades in other countries who will throw into the discussion if they have any points they wish to make about their own nations. So what would then an escape from this trap look like? Because there's another half to this trap. The jaws of a man trap are always twofold. There's the right side of it, which is, of course, that you have a collapse into national chauvinism, or I should say bourgeois forms of chauvinism and nationalism. But then there's the left side of it as well, which is the collapse into national nihilism, which here Lenin talks about. And Lenin also talks about the fact that the working class, of course, as the most progressive class, and the class that, of course, is rooted in the nation and can't go anywhere else, has an attachment to what Lenin refers to as the fatherland, which, of course, the ruling class, particularly in the imperialist nations, really doesn't have anymore. Especially, as I say, in imperialist nations like Britain, the upper end of the capitalist class, those who are, of course, the most direct beneficiaries of imperialism, these are people who can invest anywhere and go anywhere and live anywhere in the world. They feel no more attachment to this country other than perhaps this is where they file their tax returns, but probably not, given the more favorable tax regimes elsewhere, even in Europe. So Lenin's writing on that, where he observes that the national sentiments of the proletariat are going to be stronger by dint of the fact that they are rooted in the country far more than the bourgeoisie are. And the same applies to an extent to the petty bourgeoisie. This is something that has to be more properly understood. And if we get to the point where we are building a workers' state in Britain, then how do you translate this into a proletarian form of the nation, a proletarian form of patriotism? And that's the interesting question. Now, we start off with the fact that, of course, a workers' state is founded not in bourgeois rule, of course. Bourgeois rule derives from, ultimately, of course, the rule of the bourgeoisie as a class, but the need of the bourgeoisie to constantly expand their capital, constantly expand the capital via finding other newer hyper-exploitable resources and sources of labor to profit from. And that, of course, drives them ultimately towards imperialism, which, of course, ideologically speaking, is propped up by various forms of chauvinism, both externally and internally. So to get to the point where we can get around that, what do we have to do? Now, first of all, once you have eliminated the profit motive, once you have eliminated the power politically and economically of the British ruling class, that eliminates the primary source of chauvinism, of racialism, of petty nationalism, I will call it, that it pollutes the minds of the proletariat and the petty bourgeoisie in Britain. Once you remove their rule and you remove the material root of chauvinism, which is the fact that Britain, when ruled as it is now by the capitalist class, is and cannot be otherwise an imperialist country. Once you've removed that class from power, then you can start to tackle the pettiness and the petty chauvinism that they promote within the subordinated classes in Britain. And that's the first step. Then you get to considerations of the nation. Considerations of the nation after a revolution, of course, are different, again, stemming from the material root. We have done away with the bourgeoisie's political and economic power. We have, by instituting the dictatorship of the proletariat, you have removed them from their position. And so therefore the proletariat now has to, via the Communist Party and the mass organizations, rule the country. And therefore the way in which the proletariat will be approaching and will feel about the nation is markedly changed. Because one of the reasons why you get the chauvinism and the petty nationalism that you do at the moment is, of course, within the working class. And we'd be foolish to ignore the fact that this does exist. And because it's promoted relentlessly by the bourgeoisie. Petty chauvinism, racialism, phony ideas about cultural, civilizational supremacy, all of the stuff you see in the bourgeois press, be it crudely expressed via like some of the more typically and openly reactionary newspapers and broadcasters, to its more woke versions in The Guardian. Essentially, like The Guardian, what The Guardian and the Daily Mail babble on about in terms of the great virtues of British civilization. They're agreed upon most of the things. They just look at slightly different facets of it. For the Daily Mail, it's, flag, fatherland, and, retreating to a country estate somewhere where you can legally shoot peasants still. For The Guardian, it's the unique contribution of Britain to civilization by the invention of several different thousand genders, and, I don't know, the ability to purchase children from Tanzania if you're above a certain income level. So it's all chauvinism of a kind, just slightly different emphasis on when you get to the differing wings of the bourgeoisie. So when you have cleaned out the class that is responsible for that, the question is then what do you do? Once the proletariat knows that it is the guiding influence in the nation, they know that they are the ruling class of the nation, the consciousness will have to, and of course will be shifting. The consciousness will already shift through the revolutionary process. But again, one of the reasons why chauvinism is popularized within the working classes, because the ruling class understand very well that the material conditions of the working class have been degenerating for many, many years. And so the promotion of chauvinism is only going to increase as we go into a deeper and deeper crisis of British imperialism. Now, when the ruling class is the working class, when the worker owns the nation and knows that he or she does own the nation, then that breeds a more responsible attitude on behalf of everybody involved, and on behalf of the worker in particular. Chauvinism is something that can be engaged in a cheap and meaningless way. It's something that is, of course, used to stoke divisions between different layers of the working class. It's something which is used to justify imperialist wars. But principally, one of the things that the bourgeoisie has found chauvinism to be the most useful for over the last 30 years in particular, but certainly over the last 20 years, is creating divisions in the different working class layers that do exist in Britain. So one of the reasons they've banged on so much about this sort of culture war, anti-Muslim stuff, is to try and build as many different walls as possible between the different communities within the British working class. And you can see that on full display in something like these pro-Israel marches that they've been trying to organize. What you see there when they're trying to whip up attendance for these things, which are actually quite poorly attended, even though they're very well budgeted national mobilizations, is that they're leaning into all this like clash of civilization stuff they've been talking about over the last 20 years, trying to whip people up against each other, trying to create divisions within the working class. And of course, the quickest way to overcome those divisions is by the working class joining together in struggle against the bourgeoisie to remove them from power in both the political and the economic sense. So when we get to building a new society, the fact that the working class as a whole has already overcome the bourgeoisie now gets to define what the nation is, that encourages a genuine level of proletarian unity across the nation in a way that simply isn't possible to build now. Not fully. You can build a level of proletarian unity up to the point where the proletariat engages in the struggle for the conquest of state power. But once you've conquered the state power, then you, of course, have to build the nation anew out of that. And that, of course, necessitates a whole new national consciousness being built alongside a continually developing proletarian consciousness. Because, of course, as Stalin and Mao and others have observed, the class struggle intensifies, but alongside that you have a struggle to redefine the British nation, in this case, along proletarian lines. And that is what we must do. That is the task that we must engage ourselves with. And it would be foolish to ignore that, because the bourgeoisie, who will attempt a counter-revolution until they are crushed everywhere, will be seeking to make appeals to national chauvinism to try and undermine proletarian rule, try and divide the working class. They were, of course, successful in doing that, ultimately due to various failures of revisionism in the Soviet Union. And so, therefore, we will have to learn the lessons of the 20th century, particularly in countries like East Germany, of building out of the ruins of imperialism, securing working class unity across the country, but also securing working class unity in a new way with our brothers and sisters in the struggle against imperialism overseas, redefining what the British nation is, cleaning out the filth of imperialism, and so emphasizing all these different and progressive aspects of our history, such as the long history of class struggle in this country, going all the way back to the Peasants' Revolt, to the progressive legacies of the New Model Army, the revolutionary legacy of the Levelers, the Diggers, and the early Chartists, early struggles for trade unionism, the battles for the vote, for instance, the struggle for the emancipation of women. So all of these form part of the legacy of the British proletariat, which will be part of working into a new form of national identity. Now, the proletariat's attraction towards nationalism, of course, the bourgeoisie understands that very well, and they understand that they can pervert and distort the noblest of impulses. Now, there's the old famous Mao quote about turning bad things into good things, but the bourgeoisie knows how to turn good things into bad things. The urge, the feeling that you want to be part of a wider group than just yourself as an isolated individual, or just yourself and your family, the idea of belonging to a nation, the idea of that it is a sort of national family, the idea of pride in the nation's history and the achievements of the nation, all of those things need not be negative. They're only negative when they are, of course, defined by the bourgeoisie. Because when they're defined by the bourgeoisie, they are in the service of chauvinism and reaction and imperialism. And you have to ask when, and I've had this conversation with so-called patriots, like who come up to various stalls I've done in the past and like start babbling about, do you love your country or not? And my question is always, well, what is it that we're loving here exactly? Okay, is it the people? Is it the various different forms of the culture? Is it the landscapes? Is it the architecture? Is it the achievements in science and technology? Is it the literature? What is it that we're actually loving and embracing here and calling our own and wanting to defend? What are all these things that you say that you love, and you're questioning what you're questioning? You're saying to me, well, do you love your country? Well, what about it are we talking here? What form does this take? Is it the love of all of those things I've just mentioned, in which case, yes, I do? Or is it that you've taken the form of loving the nation that the rich and the powerful have given to you, and that form consists of simply and solely a form of chauvinism that is based on stamping on other people, stamping on other nations, suppressing other nations for the benefit of the profit, mainly, of a tiny minority in the City of London? Because if that's your form of loving the nation, well, in actual fact, it isn't anything of the kind. Because what does it do? What has it done? Ultimately, it's an anti-national form of chauvinism. Because what it does, it's a form of fake, what I would call national pride. It's a falsely generated form of pride based on rallying the subordinated classes, particularly the proletariat in the British case, behind the parasitic and decaying British imperialism, to literally stamp on the faces and break the backs of anti-colonial struggles or subordinated nations all over the world. So does that benefit the working class? Well, the overwhelming majority of the working class, no. Does that even benefit the people who they sign up to the British military to go and do these things. Again, mostly no. I mean, you go down any street in Britain and talk to some of the homeless guys out there, there's a big number of them who have been in the military. And there's a big number of them who've served in places like Afghanistan and Iraq, who have got the signs in front of them saying homeless, hungry, ex-army. I met quite a few guys like that in Manchester, in London and other places, who for a variety of reasons were unable to adjust themselves to civilian life again. Maybe they saw and did things in the military that they couldn't get over. Or even those that come back and do find employment, a lot of them are left like horrifically scarred and damaged by the things that they saw or did. And so you sign up for this, the bourgeoisie will fill your head full of like regimental pride, national pride, rally round the flag, support the glorious King Charles the Last, etc., etc. But once you've been over there, you've shot your bullets, you've committed crimes for the empire, you've suppressed other people, and you're a broken man or a broken woman now. You girls can sign up too for this. Once you're broken and used up, well, then you're tossed out. Then you're on. If you can't find yourself employment quickly, and if you can't pull yourself together, you're out in the street. And so for those who fall for all this and sign up for it, they're quite happy to leave you fucked. I mean, the one time I've been to the United States, I saw an awful lot of this. Americans who are watching may want to testify to it. The number of guys in, particularly at the time it was San Francisco and Los Angeles, this is 1997 I'm talking about here, who were saying that they were ex-military and homeless. I imagine it's probably worse than that now, given the number who got chewed up and spat out by the US military. So if you buy in to all of this and you sign up to fight in the bourgeoisie's wars and you get to kill those damn Arabs or kill somebody else on behalf of the bourgeoisie, you get to commit some heinous crime for which you are, at least in the short term, protected by the officers and the politicians, well, ultimately you're thrown under the bus, really. When it comes down to it and the bourgeoisie needs to move on from any particular scene of the crime, they'll throw all the guys who committed the worst crimes, who actually pulled the triggers and did the dirty work, they'll all get thrown under the bus. And those who are damaged by it, they'll all end up on the street or end up hooked on something to try and cope with the mental breakdowns that a lot of them have. They'll all get thrown away. Because once you've done the dirty business, once you've pulled the trigger, once you've killed people, once you've suppressed a whole nation on behalf of the British or the American ruling class, they don't want to know you anymore. You've expended your usefulness to them. They don't give a fuck. They'll tell you that they do, but they've got to play up all this mythology to wind you up, like a tin soldier. Stick a key in your back, wind you up, and then watch you march around and then fall over when your internal mechanism snaps and there's no more energy left in you anymore. That's what they do. And I've seen guys that I grew up with go through that. But that's the side of national chauvinism that they play on to get their recruitment into their forces. And of course, it's not just about national chauvinism. Sometimes it's the only way certain guys can pick up a skill. Sometimes it's just for lack of anything else to do, for lack of any other profession out there. You can be clothed and fed to a degree and learn some kind of skill and benefit in the short term from some kind of camaraderie. But ultimately, again, like this is all short term. You are a person who in Britain, your average lifespan is what, pushing 80 now, and you'll have what, a decade and a half at most in the armies, but it's not gonna be something which ultimately does you much good in the long term, other than for a minority, mostly of the officer corps. So the point here is when you're considering about military service and stuff like that, and the appeal that military service has, and I felt that when I was younger, when I was a teenager, the appeal of, fighting for something, fighting for the nation, fighting for the flag, all of those kinds of things. You sort of grow up with that mythology, particularly the World War II mythology. Now, but let's talk now in the more positive side of things. Let's talk about the level of heroism, to contradict Mussolini and Gentile, that you can display and that the proletariat will display whilst fighting for a nation that you can truly call your own. I mean, let's just go back again and talk about the examples of the Red Army and the Great Patriotic War, the countless examples of heroism in the face of certain death, of those like Zoya, the partisan girl from the Komsomol, or Stepan Filipovic, the Yugoslav partisan who went to the gallows and held his hands up in the victory sign just before they kicked the stool away from him, and the will to carry on fighting no matter what, to carry on fighting all the way up to the gates of Berlin. And where does that come from? Now, anti-communists these days, like Colonel Douglas MacGregor, and taking his cue from Solzhenitsyn, of course, will say, oh, it was all about the appeal of Mother Russia. But of course, that's contradicted by history. The German army was making mincemeat out of the old Tsarist army in 1914 to 17, and the appeal of Mother Russia didn't exactly stop the Tsarist army completely imploding in on itself. So why did that army fight so hard? It's because they'd had 20 years or more of that at that stage of knowing that they were in the process of building a nation, the nation being built by the labors of the proletariat for the proletariat, and the proletariat was directly participating in the running of the country, the building of the 5-year plans, and seeing the achievements there. Now, put that into a perspective of proletarian nationalism, and you can see what difference that makes. When the proletariat is engaged in this cooperative, class-wide, nationwide enterprise of building the nation again out of the ruins caused by the bourgeoisie, then you're going to see a much genuinely progressive form of national pride emerged as a result of that is fused with proletarian internationalism, and therefore avoids the falling into chauvinism. And of course, the biggest factor that will cause it to avoid falling into chauvinism is, of course, the lack of profit motive and the lack of Britain being an imperialist country anymore. Of course, the legacies of imperialism and chauvinism will have to be properly dealt with through the education system. And of course, the biggest influence will be the continued struggle of the proletariat to build the nation anew. But this is the correct and more positive way to view things, rather than just airily dismissing national sentiment and national feeling. The positive role that a new national sentiment, a new patriotism can create, can only be unlocked by the proletarian revolution, by the proletariat becoming the ruling class. And once that has been done, then you can start to talk about a socialist fatherland, a Britain which is a truly unified nation amongst all its different working class communities coming together in one unified class, in one unified country, which has left behind the narrow, petty and chauvinistic attitudes that the bourgeoisie works so hard to create within the proletariat today. All of that is left behind by the combined struggle to rid ourselves of the ruling class and then build the nation anew through the creation of a planned economy, through the direct participation of the working class in the building of socialism in Britain. That will be the biggest spur to ridding us of the divisive chauvinism, both of the ruling class and their shadows in the social democracy. Right. We will now pause for questions and comments. So where are we? We've got a lot of people commenting tonight. Joe Heresy says, pronounced like heresy. Noted. CJ says, Alex's public self-criticisms are a welcome change from most leftists. What makes him a more credible Marxist than almost anyone else claiming that title. You honour me, comrade. It's, well, I'm never afraid to admit when I'm wrong, because I've been wrong quite a lot. Bear in mind, I first read the Communist Manifesto in the year 2000. That's probably before, well, either some of you watching this were either very, very young or perhaps hadn't even been born yet. So I've had 24 years, it's almost a quarter of a century, to get a lot of things wrong. I've been a member of Trotskyite organization, which was wrong about everything. And I'm still discovering just how wrong they truly were about so many different things. And I've experienced the insides of the trade union bureaucracy and the Labour Party and seen how utterly terrible that is. I mean, you want to talk about chauvinism. There are very few places in Britain that are more chauvinistic than some branches of the social democracy. Some of the racists in there would put the Tories to shame, seriously. I mean, some of these people I ran into in the Labour Party, they still can't get over the fact that the Irish are independent now, or at least most of Ireland is independent. And that's like Labour Party councillors. So when I talk about the chauvinism of social democracy, yeah, I've experienced that too. So let's move on to look at other comments. Cobra Commander comments that he was an ANCOM, if you can believe it. Well, I was an anarchist for about a year. I went from Trotskyism to anarchism and back to Trotskyism again. That's like a really terrible trifecta. But not even a trifecta, because you just end up back at the original starting point again. Marius comments that he was a raging ultra-leftist for years too. Cobra Commander says, anarchy is like having heart with no brain, simple. And Marius says, Maoism is similar in that regard. Yeah, I would always say that Western Maoism in particular is like abysmal. I mean, at least with like places like Nepal or the Naxals in India to a degree, like these are, or the Filipino Maoist movement. These are all at least serious organizations waging a life and death struggle in their respects. This is not the case for a bunch of dumb students with a fetish for Mao posters in France or Britain or the United States. They're not waging a protracted people's war. Some of them think they are, but they're doing it exclusively by posting on Tumblr, which isn't going to win the peasants over anytime soon. And it's just completely divorced from the reality of like what Mao Zedong thought actually was, and what even the reality of the Cultural Revolution was, to be honest. Good evening to Ben Kavanagh. Good evening to you, comrade. Cobra Commander says, it wasn't until I learned about Paul Robeson that I started to unlearn my fear of Stalin. Reading Mao made me know I'm a communist. Good point about Paul Robeson there. Stalin is the most lied about man on earth. Very true, from Jenny. President Jesus says, please tell me Alex still thinks MAGA communism is dumb as shit. Yeah, I do. Yeah, that's like trying to square a circle. It's just right opportunism, to be blunt. Otis says, good evening, comrades. Good evening to you. MAGA communism will just be MAGA pretty soon. Well, let's be fair. The people in it will go one of two ways. Some will just become communists. Some will just go off and become like opportunists in the Trump movement, especially if Trump wins again. If they allow him to run, of course. Ian Foster, good evening to you, comrade. Pulgasari, good evening to you. CJ says, since the communists have been socialists that have been the real patriots, the bourgeoisie, if allowed to hold the flag, will only stick it in the dunghill. Good use of the old quote there, CJ. And that's an entirely correct observation. Just look at like how the bourgeoisies, we mentioned this previously, like France or Italy or any of the conquered nations of Europe that got rolled into by the Nazis, treated their own national traditions and their own national pride. It was entirely linked to their material interests. Why did the French bourgeoisie sabotage the struggle against the Nazis and basically stage a coup to bring in a fascist regime? They did so not because they had a particular liking for Hitler and his strange visions of Aryan supremacy, though I'm sure some of them did. They did so because they needed to, as they saw it, they prioritized setting up a terroristic dictatorship to smash the French working class and to smash principally the French Communist Party. And they were perfectly prepared to have the nation occupied by the Germans for years. And CJ's point about the commune is well made, which is that revealed for the first time, or perhaps not the first time, but the first time it was very publicly and internationally revealed that the French ruling class were more than happy to have the Prussians sit there and aid them in crushing the commune than they were concerned about freeing the nation of Prussian occupation. And so as soon as their progressive role collapses, the bourgeoisie just uses patriotism and nationalism as another tool to manipulate the proletariat. It's nothing to do with defending the nation. The British ruling class would burn this nation to a cinder if they thought there was a chance that the proletariat would unite and chase them out of power. They don't care. They don't care about all the things that you, as a working class person, care about in a country. The ruling class do not. If they can't have it, they will make sure that you don't, one way or the other, or they will try to. Again, look at how the Russian bourgeois acted in the Civil War. Those that didn't defect over to the side of the revolution stuck with the white armies, who, of course, were quite happy to act as the enforcement arms of the imperialists, who would have completely subjugated Russia to the control of the British, French, and American imperialists. And they would have done so whilst waving the flag and screaming about national pride, when the material reality would have been that all of that national pride was just a bunch of romanticist garbage, a veil to be draped over the squalid reality of the complete subordination of the country to imperialism, which is, by the way, what the Ukrainian so-called nationalists do. And they're not nationalists. Let's just deal with that while in passing. I've said it before, but none of these cretins are nationalists. They are anti-national, because what have they done? Again, let's go back to, let's always start with the material reality. What have these Hitler fetishists in Western Ukraine actually delivered? They've delivered the country into the arms of imperialism. They've sold the country to BlackRock and the Vanguard Group and the other leading representatives of American imperialism. That's nationalism? No. That's petty chauvinism used to mobilize some of the most backward layers in the country to act as the boot boys and the enforcers of American monopoly capitalism. There's nothing pro-Ukraine about that. There's nothing pro-national about that. Ukrainian culture was much more better represented and developed under the Soviet system than it ever has been through these fucking clowns and them, their extremely online Hitler obsessions. They're celebrating, in the form of Hitler and the Nazis, men who did reduce this country of Ukraine, the nation of Ukraine, to abject slavery. And the descendants of Petlura and Bandera and Shoikovich have, again, reduced the country to abject slavery under American imperialism, just as their predecessors did to the country in the 1940s, just as Petlura wanted to reduce it to a subjugated vassal of German imperialism or British imperialism. He wasn't fussy about who he sold it to in the 1900s. This is where it all ends up, because this is where petty bourgeois nationalism, and by the way, I don't mean the petty bourgeoisie, I mean small bourgeois nationalism, ends up in these subjugated countries. It just ends up with them selling it to the lowest bidder, particularly when it's run by the most backward compradors who would, rather the nation be burnt to a crisp and everyone in it killed, rather than lose their position as the chief caretakers for imperialism. So, right. Cobra Commander says, my issue with Maupin is his ego. Other than that, I don't care who you follow, like high school metal poser argument stuff. Not important to me. Very true. DE, good evening from Hampshire, and good evening back to you. Anybody got any problems with the stream, let me know. I think it seems to be working fine. It says excellent connection here. Hello to Dingo Ate Me Baby, the man with the greatest name on the internet. Kent, hello to you in Minneapolis. Beju says, I wish one day I'll get to cheer England at football under a dictatorship of the proletariat. I'm sure the feeling will be closer to matching what I feel when I'm watching my club team, Arsenal. Yeah, that's what it should feel like. I mean, I can't support the English national team for a whole variety of reasons. Sort of petty, ridiculous chauvinism being one of them, but mostly because I just feel nothing whilst watching it. Like, what am I watching? I'm watching the visual representation of the City of London, the sporting representation of the City of London, a bunch of out-of-touch millionaires who might have been working class once, but now are just a bunch of fucking spoilt children running around a pitch and diving all over the place. No, just want nothing to do with that. It represents a nation which needs to be essentially overturned and started again. And in sporting terms, it's got nothing to it. I can't associate with this form of the nation, therefore I can't associate with its sports team. Bear in mind that the fascists and chauvinists of various different kinds will always accuse Marxists of being anti-national and anti-family. The actual truth of what Marx and Engels and Lenin and Stalin and Mao said about all these things is that just as Engels defined Marxists or communists as being for the abolition of the bourgeois family, not the family as a concept, the bourgeois family, the family based on property transactions and the subjugation of women by the bourgeois and bourgeois marriage, not family and marriage and all that goes with it. Just as the nation will be completely redefined as under the dictatorship of the proletariat. It will look different. So we're not against nations and countries. We stand against the bourgeois concept of those, the bourgeois practice of those, because it has no progressive content left in it anymore. And there needs to be a fundamental change to the dictatorship of the proletariat, which will more properly express all of the cultures and all of the positive aspects of nationhood, be it Britain, France, wherever, the United States. Only under the rule of the working class can the most positive aspects of the nation be fully expressed. Right. Jenny says it's depressing to see people fall for the same old tricks over and over again. That is, but I think we're making progress on that. It's going to be a long fight, don't misunderstand me, but I think progress is being made. Beju says, you just know that as the struggle heats up that the racism will be ramped up. It will get horrid. They'll try. If they're under pressure and they think they're going to lose, they're going to play every racialist card they possibly can, and we need to be ready for that. Right, where are we now? Scrolled too far down. Movie Maker Joe, good evening to you. Marius said, I've seen elderly Vietnam veterans alongside young Iraq war vets. Generations of this crap. Yeah, I think you're referring to the homeless veterans question. Pulgasari, Hollywood tried to make this point several times, but this film somehow in some quarters became subsumed into a version of chauvinism. Are you talking about the homeless veteran question? Yeah, well, if you want to go back all the way, look at Rambo. Rambo First Blood, good film. The original book, I believe, was like more anti-war, and Stallone changed it into like where he gives that ranting speech at the end about how he was spat on by anti-war protesters, which, by the way, there was never any documented cases of that happening, and he was called a baby killer, and they wouldn't let us win and all that. Kind of like derails into chauvinism at the end, which is what a lot of these films that are meant to be sort of critical of the US military end up doing. They end up diverting at the very end into a reinforcement of chauvinism. Then, of course, Rambo heroically fought with Osama bin Laden to free Afghanistan from communism. That Day Will Come says, reminds me of a song, Little Boy Soldiers. Yes, by the Jam. One of Paul Weller's finest. Good evening to Klavek. Jenny says, I'm sure you guys have seen the Honor Your Oath guy who goes around holding the sign, God bless the homeless vets, and he always gets fucked with by the pigs and Karens everywhere he goes. We really support our troops, don't we? Lol. People don't even want to hear about them, much less do anything for them. Yeah, like I said, and that's Jenny's comment there. It's they are happy to have you in. They're happy to have you waving the flag, and then they're happy to dispose of you when you're no longer any use for them. That's the capitalist system as a whole, and that's imperialism and its armies in particular. Beju says, Russia defeated the Nazis not only due to Stalin's planning, but because they had a deeper reason to go to war to defend the land they helped create, the motherland. And that's exactly right. Battle Cossack says, Buenas noches, camaradas. Greetings from Argentina. Hello to an Argentine comrade. Solidarity in the struggle against Milei the lunatic. Marius says, self-criticism is absolutely central to Marxism. How else is improvement possible? That's why arrogance is antithetical to being a genuine communist. Very correct there. Battle Cossack says, I was an angry libertarian. Well, we all have our moments. I was a Trotskyite once. That might be even worse. Jenny says, I was anarcho-curious for a little while, but it revealed itself rather quickly for the idealist nonsense that it is. Ian Foster says, we live and learn. I knocked on doors and campaigned for Blair's Labour in 97. Not proud of that. Well, I knocked on doors and campaigned for Corbyn's Labour in 2017. Not particularly proud of that. Jenny says, MAGA communism is misunderstood, but I understand people not thinking it's a good brand name. Okay. We may come back to that in the future. Marius says it's MAGA communism is basically a huge troll and it enrages and triggers both MAGA and leftists alike. Well, look, I understand that, but I don't think you build a political project on trolling, to be honest. Battle Cossack says Ukrainian nationalists are actually libertarians. Well, in actual fact, that's what they've achieved. So Battle Cossack is right about that. Battle Cossack says, I used to be a libertarian troll with anger issues. I did overcome that. Rambo was cringe, says Jenny. I like the original, I must admit. Most of the original film, First Blood, I think is a well-made film. It's quite, until the end, when he starts going on that rant. I won't do a Sly Stallone impression. I don't think that that's ready. My Sly Stallone impression is ready for public display yet. But yeah, I enjoyed the first one. The next two, ludicrous. They're very good for watching for comedy value. Like when he goes back and he refights Vietnam and wins. He's allowed to win this time. And he goes, then he of course joins with the Taliban, or sorry, the Mujahideen, and wins the war for Ronald Reagan. Pulgasari says, yeah, I was thinking specifically about Rambo and the people I've met who wear I just wanted something to eat t-shirt. The Deer Hunter. Yeah, the Deer Hunter's a curious one, and the oeuvre of Michael Cimino is a curious one, because the Deer Hunter is a very well-made film. It's also a hideous piece of propaganda, because Cimino did this also with Heaven's Gate. He makes a film where he actually takes the point of view of like the American proletariat I think it's a steel town that it's set in. I haven't watched it for years now. I didn't really like it the first few times I saw it until I got into until I discovered Marxism and discovered critiques of it. But it's a long sequence of like, I think they're a sort of they're an American Russian community, I believe. They're meant to be. It's like De Niro, Christopher Walken, John Cazale, and the other guy's name I forget. Who you see them at the wedding, you see them at the hunting party, and that whole first sequence really well shot, really well delivered. Then you get into the Vietnam sequences, and it basically just turns into like something that would have been filmed by a fascist regime. And then Cimino, having got a lot of credit for that, undeservedly, well, as a piece of cinema, as a piece of filmmaking, yeah, it's a good piece of filmmaking. Its message is fucking awful. It's like one of the most racist films I've ever seen. Hideous piece of crap. It's far worse than like John Wayne's Green Berets. Even it makes that look subtle. But he follows it up with Heaven's Gate, which is another one of those where it's basically like he's trying to put himself on the side of the downtrodden, but of course he misses out that the downtrodden settlers are treading all over, or have trodden all over already, the Native Americans in the process. Again, Heaven's Gate I find to be an absolutely fascinating film. Again, like a completely very, very admirable in many artistic respects. But again, the politics of it are confused at best. Very good Christopher Walken performance, and performance by Chris Christopherson as well in that film. Jenny says it's wild how many people still believe the nonsense about Vietnam protesters. Yeah, that all comes from Sliced Alone. A man who, as far as I know, never served in Vietnam, even though he's old enough to have done so. He managed to avoid that. But I bet a lot of people think that he did. Just goes to show, like, the bourgeoisie takes the cultural production very seriously. And it will, or it used to, back, like, well-made propaganda, because that will sink in. Rambo came up with that shit. I don't know if they came up with it or whether that was already a myth beforehand and just putting it in the Rambo film firmed it up in people's imaginations. But there are people who seriously believe that. Jenny's comment is completely correct. Banana Bender says, Jackson Hinkle said MAGA communists aren't against the abolition of private property. Well, if he did say that, then that's very silly. And the man probably needs to take some time out from streaming and read more. The 007... The 007 film was even worse than the Rambo one. Are you talking about The Living Daylights with Timothy Dalton? Yeah, that's a hilarious film. Timothy Dalton did 2 Bond movies, one of which I still find very entertaining, which is basically Bond does Miami Vice whilst also taking in, like, the Iran-Contra scandal, fraudulent televangelists, and he ends up fighting a bad guy played by one of the great 80s villains, Robert Davi, who now is a big Donald Trump supporter. So AJ Williamson says, I'm late to the party. Well, you can catch up on playback. The CIA ruins everything, says Jenny. Yeah. Ben says, is it possible to put together important references on socialism, patriotism, and nationalism? It is possible, Ben. I will work on it myself. It'll probably be next week before I get moving on that, though. Battle Cossack says, when I think about UK anti-war movies, I think about Fred's. Fred's, yeah, that was one that was done about nuclear war. There was The War Game by Peter Watkins. Also Culloden by Peter Watkins. I believe you can find both of those on YouTube now. Paul Gassari says, if you haven't seen the Rambo cartoon in which he meets a penitent Santa Claus, who it turns out used to be in the arms trade, thank me later. That sounds like a classic waiting to be discovered. Paul Gassari, thank you very much for that one. Okay, right. We are getting on towards 10 to midnight here in Britain, so I'm going to draw this to a close today. I will take up Ben Kavanagh's request for the Socialism, Patriotism, Nationalism reference list. We'll come back to this if we need to. I hope that you have gained something out of this. And I will be back again with you at the same time tomorrow. Thanks to everybody who's contributed to a very interesting discussion in the chat. As always good to see you here. And if you can like and share the stream across various different platforms, that'll do us a big favor. Thank you, everybody, for tuning in. I'll be back with you again tomorrow.
Oh, Stalin was a mighty man, and a mighty man was he. He led the Soviet people on the road to victory. All through the revolution, he fought at Lenin's side, and they made a combination till the day that Lenin died. He said, come on, you people, we must work with brain and hand. And then one day the Nazis came into the Soviet land. They plundered to the Volga, to Stalingrad. And then Joe Stalin said, come on, me boys, and kicked them out again. Oh, Stalin was a southerner, in Georgia he was born, where the oranges grow thick and fast and fields of waving corn. And Stalin is a farmer, his fingers they are green, and he has planted the biggest crop the world has ever seen. One day he looked upon the map and frowned and shook his head. There's too much brown and not enough green, these were the words he said. We'll have to change the weather, boys, he said, and then he smiled. So let's begin by planting trees along 3,000 miles. So Stalin rolled his sleeves up then and said it's time to start. The Volga River and the Don, they are too far apart. I think we'd better join them, so come and help me, pal, and we'll build a mighty waterway, the Volga-Don Canal. Then Stalin went into the north, and there saw rivers three, all emptying their waters into the polar sea. Now that's not right, Joe Stalin said, these rivers, they're ours. We'll turn them round and make them work and make electric power. There was a range of mountains that were standing in the way, so Stalin put his hand out and smoothed them all away. For Joe, he is determined to make the land all green, and that's the biggest project that the world has ever seen. Oh, Stalin is a mighty man, and he has a mighty plan. He's harnessed nature to the plow to work for the good of man. He's hammered out the future, the fortune he has seen, and he's made the worker state the best the world has ever seen.